Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. David Hume devotes an entire section, indeed number 8, to the question of liberty and necessity in his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And when we're talking about liberty, we mean liberty of the will or liberty of volition. Do we actually have what is typically called freedom of the will? Can we choose, for example, between alternatives freely, or are there always, if we think about necessity, is there something necessitating our choices and therefore our actions, like some hidden motives in the background that even though we might feel ourselves to be free or think ourselves to be free, we're not really free. We're acting in a mechanical sort of fashion, going from causes which we don't really know to effects, our volitions in our mind, treated as other causes for other effects, the actions that we then do. And Hume actually, after a little bit of going back and forth about, how people should be on the same page about things, but they haven't clarified definitions and all that, he says that everybody really is in agreement in the doctrine of necessity. And so what is the doctrine of necessity? He tells us that the relation between cause and effect and our idea of necessity and causation arises entirely from the uniformity observable in the operations of nature, where similar objects are constantly conjoined together and the mind is determined by custom to infer the one from the appearance of the other. So if you've read earlier parts of the Inquiry, this is, sort of going over old ground. We have a constant conjunction, and then we have a customary connection in the mind, sort of replicating that, leading us to go from what we presume to be the cause to the effect, and we call that cause and effect or causality, or in this case, necessity. The idea is that the cause necessitates the effect. And so he tells us these two circumstances form the whole of that necessity which we ascribe to matter, to material objects. Beyond the constant conjunction of similar objects and the consequent inference from one to the other, we have no notion, he says, of any necessity of connection. So we can go from this about matter to thinking about how our minds and bodies interact, how I decide to lift my hand at this point in time. And we can also think about the interior operations of the mind as well along similar lines. And so he says, all mankind have ever allowed, without any doubt or hesitation, that these two circumstances take place in the voluntary actions of men and in the operations of mind. If that's the case, it must follow that all human beings have always agreed in the doctrine of necessity. And why have they disagreed with each other? Merely for not understanding each other. Now, that's one way to look at it. And so we've got these two key things that are coming up throughout this section. Constant conjunction of similar objects, we observe that, right? And then inference by custom from one object to another. Easy enough to observe in the outside world. We can also observe this in the interactions between our mind or whatever it happens to be and our body. For instance, poking myself, I'm not actually going to do anything that hurts, but if I were to do that, I certainly have a sensation here. Right? If I poke myself in the eye, I'd have a sensation of pain here. I just have pressure. How does that work? Well, this happens over and over again. We see babies, in fact, learning about their environment through doing all sorts of what we would later on call dumb mistakes. Actually, toddlers do that as well. And what they're doing is acquiring an understanding of causality, the interactions between material objects and their body and their mind. Similarly, we can talk about our own interior operations of our mind, the way in which the faculties operate with each other, the way our ideas are put together. So there's this constant conjunction. And then inference in our mind by custom from one object to another. After we've developed a kind of map of causal relations, then we carry that around with ourselves and we know what to expect in the future. So if I take the piece of chalk and we're talking about something here that we believe has absolute necessity, or at least as good as we get of that in a Humean world, and I drop it, well, there it goes. I knew that was going to happen, right? Nobody thought otherwise. You weren't like, well, maybe it'll hang in the air or something like that. No. We're pretty confident about that. So why do we think that we're actually free and that human actions are not necessitated or human volitions? What is actually going on there? So one way of talking about this is, well, we've just got our understanding about this sort of thing mixed up. But Hume also brings up another interesting thing a little bit later on. He says that I've frequently considered what could possibly be the reason why all mankind, though they have ever without hesitation acknowledged the doctrine of necessity in their whole practice and reasoning, have yet discovered such a reluctance to acknowledge it in words and have rather shown a propensity to profess the contrary opinion. Why is it that human beings, not just now, but throughout all history, want to say, no, I'm actually free, and you're free too? Well, this has to do, as he says, with a kind of ignorance. He says that if we examine the operations of the body and the production of effects from their causes, we find that all our faculties can never carry us any further in our knowledge of this relation than barely to observe that objects are constantly conjoined together. The mind is carried by this customary transition from the appearance of one to the other to the belief of the other. And then he says, when we turn our reflections towards the operations of our own minds, and we ask ourselves, okay, what's going on here? He says that we have motives. As a matter of fact, everybody has motives, multiple motives in play at any given time. But we don't feel, and he uses that word feel. It's very important because belief is a matter of feeling, right? We don't feel the connection between the motive, which is the cause, and the action, which is the effect. So we think ourselves more free than we are. A great example of this is when you talk to somebody who's been taken in by a con man and you ask them, did you make these decisions of your own free will? And after a bit of being ashamed and say, no, he forced me and all that, they'll probably say, yeah, I'm such a dummy. I did this thing. I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I feel so bad about it. Hume would say, well, the con man was able to get the responses that they wanted from you because they understood how human nature worked and how to make suckers part from their money, and they pushed the right buttons. They involved the right motives and actions. So really, you're not that responsible for it. You just don't feel the connection between those things. And so he says, when we feel no connection of the motive and the action, we're apt to suppose there's a difference between the effects that result from material force and those which result from thought and intelligence. So that's one thing. The other thing that he talks about as well is there's a certain regularity to human nature, but people every once in a while do weird stuff kind of out of the blue. He calls it going into a frenzy. But he says even that can be explained by other motives. We would just need to dig into the psychology and the situation of that person, or maybe what's going on in their brain, and then we could actually predict that. Now, he has some arguments in favor of the doctrine of necessity. One of these is quite long, and we're going to discuss it elsewhere in the depth that it deserves, but it's pretty straightforward. He says that human beings are pretty similar. He says it's universally acknowledged. We should think about whether this really is universally acknowledged, but Hume says that it is, that there's a great uniformity among the actions of human beings in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations. The same motives always produce the same actions, the same events follow from the same causes. And we're not going to go into depth with his examples there. But this is a big assertion. There's this uniformity of human actions and motives. That means that we can actually predict what people are going to do based on what people have done in the past. Or we can sort of, we can go from our present, where we observe human beings now, and if we want to understand why ancient Romans did the things that they did, or some far-off people in a land that we've never been to act the way that we do, we just project what we know about human nature onto them. And if that's the case, then we really do have some support for this doctrine of necessity. Another thing that he talks about that's really quite interesting is what he calls the mutual dependence of human beings. Meaning that the things that we do, this is sort of a pragmatic argument, the things that we do are assuming that other people are going to behave in reliable, predictable ways. He says, the mutual dependence of men is so great in all societies, scarce any human action is entirely complete in itself or is performed without some reference to the actions of others, which are requisite to make it answer fully the intention of the agent. So when I want to do something and anybody else is involved in it, I don't assume that their actions are totally random or just willful. I assume that they're going to operate according to certain, rules and causes. So he says, the poorest artificer who labors alone expects at least the protection of the magistrate to ensure him the enjoyment of the fruits of his labor. He expects when he carries his goods to market and offers them at a reasonable price, he'll find purchasers and shall be able by the money he acquires to engage others to supply him with those commodities which are requisite for his substance. So we live within a matrix of other people's actions and motives, right? Another thing that he points out, here's another consideration, is that if we didn't have a regularity, a predictable regularity, if we understand the motives of human beings for human actions, if we didn't have that, he says, what would become of history had we not a dependence on the veracity of the historian according to the experience which we've had of mankind? How could politics be a science if laws and forms of governments had not a uniform influence on society? Where would be the foundation of morals if particular characters had no determinate power to produce particular sentiments, and if these sentiments had no constant operation on our actions? And with what pretense could we employ our criticism on any poet or polite author if we could not pronounce the conduct and sentiments of his actors either natural or unnatural? He says, if we want to have all of these disciplines, we have to have necessity of actions and volitions, right? The last thing that he says, which has always stuck with me since I read it, is this, because of the example that he has. He says, when we consider how aptly natural and moral evidence, the things that we're actually seeing, link together and form only one chain of argument, we shall make no scruple to allow that they are of the same nature and derived of the same principles. Here's the example that I love. A prisoner who has neither money nor interest discovers the impossibility of his escape as well when he considers the obstinacy of the jailer as the walls and bars with which he is surrounded, and in all attempts for his freedom chooses rather to work on stone and iron of the one than upon the inflexible nature of the other. So in some respects, human beings can even be more predictable than stone or iron if we know the motives, if we know the manifold, the matrix of the motives that are impinging upon what we call their will or volition and then producing the actions, or in this case, the inaction of not letting the person out. So Hume is saying everything that we do is really necessitated. It's just sometimes the case that we don't feel it to be so, and that's largely because we don't actually understand the connections between motives and actions. But everything is, as far as the will goes, necessitated. This is the doctrine of necessity.